Welcome to the Ty Beal Show, where we discuss food, science, and life. I'm Ty Beal, a scientist at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, or GAIN. My guest today is Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, a professor of infection and global health at University College London, and an infectious disease doctor at the Hospital for Tropical Diseases in London. As one of the BBC's leading broadcasters for children and adults, his work has won 2 BAFTAs, and he is the author of the Sunday Times and New York Times bestseller, Ultra-Processed People. In our conversation, we discuss the science and politics of ultra-processed foods and how to balance evidence with real life. A quick note before we start. This podcast is separate from my role at GAIN. Okay, let's dive in. Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
So nice to see you, Ty.
Yeah, I don't think we've ever connected, but I've followed your work for a few years, and you're always very engaging, interesting, and so I'm really happy to be able to speak with you over video now.
Well, it's a pleasure. Now I have to live up to that.
You have a sense of humor, so I want to set the bar very high. We're gonna have to laugh here. We're gonna have to learn. It's gonna have to be entertaining, okay?
We're gonna laugh, we're gonna cry. It's gonna be a journey.
So you're a very well-known doctor. You're a television presenter, author. You've explored everything, and obviously your research in infectious disease, but into food systems and nutrition. So when did you start to focus really in on nutrition and this concept of ultra-processed foods, and what drew you into that?
So I'm a molecular biologist by background. I like taking things to pieces and trying to reducing them. That's the way that molecular biology works. Really, because of my broadcasting, I do a lot of work for the BBC talking about health, and the thing that gets you clicks and gets you viewers is if you talk about not even nutrition, if you just talk about weight. And so I spent the better part of a decade making television programs. I mean, can I name them? I mean, I made one called What's the Right Diet for You? And it was actually with some incredible scientists, with Giles Yeo from Cambridge, Professor Susan Jebb, a great team of people. But the premise of this show, which was more than 10 years ago, was kind of celebrating the idea of weight loss and the idea that people live with excess weight and other diet-related diseases because of an information deficit. So if only we could just tell people, just eat this number of calories and eat this kind of food, then they would eat that food and then they would achieve full and perfect physical health. And so we did this for about 10 years, and millions of people watched my programs and similar programs. And then eventually you realize that the problem is only getting worse, and somehow a mixture of blame and shame and putting responsibility on the individual isn't really working. And so my focus moved more into trying to look at what the sort of deeper causes of people eating poor diets were. So I started to do more work on commercial determinants of health, particularly in nutrition, particularly infant nutrition. And so almost the broadcasting led the research, and now almost all of my research is to do with food systems and its political economy stuff. And although I do also do some basic nutrition research, my group just did a randomized control trial on ultra-processed food. So in a weird way, it was the public demand for what was interesting that led me to, that essentially challenged me to really try and contribute to, it's a bit grand to say fixing the problem, but really attempt to try and solve the problem.
That's fascinating. So insightful that you actually learned from the audience and the public about what the interest is, how do we solve the problem, what's not working. And I think in the field that I work in, sort of this nutrition public health research field, we have often come up with that, where it's sort of, we face the reality that you can educate, you can do all of that, and it still doesn't really make the big impact that you want to see. And so there is education and awareness is part of it, but it's not the full story by any means. So I'd love to dig into more about your experience here. And you, of course, you wrote this book called Ultra-Processed People. Encourage everyone to pick it up if you haven't. I think this came out 2 years ago now.
I think it was 3 years
2023,
ago now. I think it
3 years
was.
ago.
I think it was. Yeah, it was 3 years ago. It was first published. It was published in the US and the UK and Canada all at the same time. I should know this. I'm pretty sure it was 2022. What are we? 2025. Yeah, 3 and a bit years ago.
Yeah, life's
And
a
thank you
blur.
for the
So,
plug, Ty. There's no one I'd rather was plugging my book.
well, that's very kind. I'm a big fan. I've really been interested in this topic, and I think as we've seen recently, there's actually been a lot of attention to this topic. If you think about the US, there's actually a call to define ultra processed foods from the FDA, from USDA. I've been involved in a comment on that to try to give some perspective. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of talk. You actually see in government now, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but now in the US, you actually see senators and stuff talking about the term ultra processed foods, which is new. We have not really seen that before. So I think it's very much top of people's mind in the public. And then the scientific community are very kind of intensely debating, are these useful? You have crowds who are saying this is a terrible thing, like it doesn't really mean anything. How is this science? It's just this sort of really oversimplification. And then you have others on the on the other side, it's like, really, this is the key thing. This definition is sort of the key thing that is wrong with our food system and our modern food environment today, and everything in between. So when we talk about your book, Ultra Processed People, it's contributed to this dialogue. It's really brought, I think, mainstream too. I think a lot of people haven't heard of this term. I love the word ultra processed people. It's really not just about the one food you eat. It's about this dominant diet. What is the big, majority of the calories that you're eating? And you have done some in this book. You describe some of this sort of trialing on yourself, some of this diet stuff. So I think you can tell me a little more about it. But you had a diet that was around 80% ultra processed foods, wanted to track the effects. That's a similar, I think, cutoff to Kevin Hall's study at the NIH, or is sort of, 80% ultra processed versus something more like almost entirely minimally processed. So when you did that self experiment, what was the most surprising thing, or maybe any counterintuitive change you noticed in your body, your brain, behavior? And did there, like, any of these effects linger even after returning to a normal diet?
Well, a normal diet, of course, is not my normal diet. I suspect you and I eat very abnormal diets. If you're
Right.
privileged and educated, you eat a really weird diet. The thing about a diet comprising 80% of its calories coming from ultra processed food is that is a very normal diet. Around 20% of people in the UK eat that diet. And on
Mhm.
average, we consume 60% of our calories. I want to come back to all the definition stuff. I hope we're gonna come back to that because it's become so polarized, and I hope I can say something moderate about all that.
Let's
But
get into it. Yeah.
I
We
mean,
could do that later,
my
whenever.
my experience of the diet was I was very somewhat like Kevin. I was very skeptical going into this that this was really a useful way of thinking about food. My background as a clinician, as a scientist, was thinking about nutrients, and I
Mhm.
understood food in terms of its component parts and their effect on the body. And I didn't think there was very much controversy there. So I went on this diet really as the first participant in the randomized control trial that we just published in Nature Medicine a couple of months ago, in August, in fact.
Mhm.
Um, so when I approached it, we were really just asking this very open question of going, well, would we, if someone goes on this diet like this for 4 weeks, would we really see very much that it would be worth measuring? What would the effects be? And I was very curious as a broadcaster to understand the kind of narrative around it. Like, is it, I was at the time in my early to mid 40s. I'm just going to eat a diet that every teenager in the country is eating. Nothing's going to happen to me. I mean, so we did. There were three main effects. I gained an enormous amount of weight, and it's important to say I was not force feeding myself. It wasn't supersize me. I just took the brakes off. So I ate. It was as if I removed whatever the part of my cortex that would normally stop me eating if I felt like McDonald's or a meal deal for lunch. I just, if I felt like it, I would eat it. And so
Mhm.
I was snacking a lot, but I wasn't trying to force feed myself. I put on 6 kilos in 4 weeks. So if
Wow.
I, I'm an 80 something kilo person at the time. So I would have roughly doubled my body weight in 1 year if I'd kept going. Now I have an identical twin brother, a genetic clone of myself, who, when he went to live in the States, he did his master's in Boston. He was there for a year and he put on 25 kilos in 1 year. So I've kind of done the natural
Wow.
experiment of this. So um, it felt clear that this is food that was interfering with my body's ability to regulate its own weight. Now, obviously, I could journalistically force feed myself and create a good story, but we then measured some things it's very hard to fake. So we measured my hormone response to a meal. I'm gonna see if I can quickly call up the results here. So we measured body composition, subjective measures of appetite, and then we measured the response to a standard meal. And what we saw was the satiety hormone, the peptide YY. After a standard meal, we saw that hormone go up by 60% at the beginning of the experiment. Then I ate 4 weeks of UPF. And then we measured the PYY response to the same meal, and it only went up by 23%. So the ultra processed food is not, at least from this data point in me, we saw that it was interfering with the hormone response to a standard meal, not merely the hormone response to itself, as it were. We looked at response to ghrelin. So again, we saw a 30% increase in ghrelin in the fasted state at the beginning, but only a 12% after the meal when I'd done the diet. And then we saw changes in inflammation, like CRP went up twofold. So this gave us a sense that there were real physiological changes. And then we also did MRI scans where we looked in simple terms at physiological connections, not hardware connections, if you like, but software connections between different parts of the brain. So a massive uptick in resting state connectivity between the automaticity parts of the behavior parts at the back of the brain, the cerebellum, and the reward and addiction stuff kind of in the middle of the brain, the limbic system. We don't really know how to interpret that in one person, and we haven't reported that yet from the larger study. But certainly these were very robust, and they lasted out to 6 weeks after that. We repeated the MRIs. So my subjective experience was that the food was extremely easy to eat. I really enjoyed eating it until midway through the diet. I had a call with a colleague in Brazil, Fernanda Rauber, who's on Carlos Montero's team. And Fernanda kept sort of saying to me, it's not food, it's an industrially produced edible substance. So Fernanda kept underlining this, it's not real food to me. And I sat down that night to eat. In reality, it was a meal of Kentucky Fried Chicken. In the book, I think it's a different meal. When you're writing a book, you've put things in a particular order, and I'd already used KFC somewhere else, so I changed it around. But it was KFC hot wings, and I could not. These are my favorite food in the whole world. I couldn't finish the meal. So I was going on this diet. I put myself on a sort of aversion experiment, which had the peculiar effect of curing me of a somewhat sort of addicted relationship to this kind of food. So I no longer wanted it, but I still sort of felt like I wanted it. And there's lots of really interesting neuroscience around the difference between sort of wanting and liking that I then, in the weeks and months at the end of the diet, as I just sort of stopped eating this, I'd find myself, as an example, I would scroll the Deliveroo or the Uber Eats apps, or the food delivery apps, and
Mm-hmm.
I sometimes I'd order the meal and then not be able to eat it. Sometimes I wouldn't eat it. So there was this real experience of kind of missing this thing in my life, and yet finding it very disgusting when I sat down to eat it. So that was intriguing as a scientist to kind of write about. And I try. That's one of the things I'm trying to do for the lay reader in the book, I guess, is in a very gentle way, without inducing any further disordered eating. I think so many of us live with disordered relationships with food, but just trying to make them question the extent to which this is really food.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. And I love that you you studied yourself in this experience very scientifically. Of course, it's just one person, but then you also did this RCT. This is the one with I think Samuel Dickens was the lead author that came out recently.
Yeah, Sam was. I mean, he was. I was one of his many PhD supervisors. I mean, Sam's PhD was the equivalent to, a PhD plus 4 or 5 years work as a postdoc. For most people, this was just one chapter of his PhD. This large RCT that he managed to run, and this this was done in answer to policy. I mean, maybe before we talk about the RCT was done in a very particular way to answer a very particular policy question in the United Kingdom, because we were comparing with this randomized control trial, we were comparing two nutritionally matched diets, but unlike in Kevin Hall's RCT or the RCT that came out of Japan looking at ultra processed food, both our diets were nutritionally compatible with our UK national dietary guidance. In other words, they were healthy in terms of the diets were both healthy according to our UK government guidance. And we wanted to answer the question in a new way about whether or not ultra processing really is about the processing of food, or whether it really is just about the nutrient content. And most ultra processed foods are high in fat, salt, sugar, and energy density.
Mm-hmm.
So, is it worth talking a little bit about the definition and the kind of controversy? Because I don't think there is a huge amount of controversy. But it would be easy to take little things that I've said and that other people who believe that the ultra processed food definition is important, and mischaracterize them and kind of create controversy out of them. But yeah, how do you
Why
see it?
don't I share some of the things that I've heard? So I have, on this comment on the definition of ultra processed foods, it sort of also gets into the purpose of it, the utility of it. And folks like David Ludwig, you're probably familiar with his work. He is very much on the side that the definition is actually pretty much useless for policy. So I think that is a controversy, because I think you're in this camp, and I tend to be in this camp, that I think the definition is very useful. There's some nuances around. It's not perfect, and I don't think anything would be perfect. But the criticism is a few different things. So one, in the definition itself, it's sort of unclear, how do you classify a food? There's criticism that some of the drivers that would sort of put something into the ultra processed food category may not be linked to any sort of health outcome or metabolic health in particular. There's a focus on, it's really about the refined carbs. There's this saying of, okay, well, you could have a brownie that's bought at the store that's ultra processed, but you could make it, or your grandma could make it, with sort of sugar and refined flour. And how is that any healthier, right? And then to go a little bit further, when you hear the critiques about the studies that were previously done, Kevin Hall's study and the one in Japan, I think there were 2 weeks and then 1 week. And if you look at the pattern of what's happening, there's this drastic change in calorie intake, right? I think it's 500 calories in Kevin Hall's study and about 800 calories in the Japan study. And corresponding with that, you see rapid changes in weight, right? Gaining of weight in the ultra processed group, typically losing weight in the unprocessed group. But you see this trend of convergence where, over the trial period, the weight gain, the intake is actually converging closer and closer. And so a lot of the feedback or criticisms that I have heard is sort of, this would probably end up eventually balancing out. Probably not a big deal. It's really just this short-term trial. It doesn't really show anything. Again, maybe we can get into this now with your response and sort of your study, but like 8 weeks to me, and maybe you can go into the specifics here. To me, the 8 weeks trial, much more compelling to me to answer that question of, okay, well, what does happen after 2 weeks, after 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks? And I think in your study, the other feedback that I get is, oh, well, both groups lost weight and improved their health, right? With even the ultra processed group, but it wasn't the same. And so can you talk about the differences and talk about your sort of view of how does this play out over the longer term, not over just the 1 to 2 weeks?
Well, let's try and deal with these sort of comments one by one. So if someone says the UPF definition has no utility for policy, part of me is willing to meet them some way on that. If you mean that it is not a useful instrument to discriminate healthy from unhealthy food in law, in terms of labeling an individual package, I would be fairly inclined to agree. I still think it fits into a discussion of how to define unhealthy products, and it should inform how we think about unhealthy products. But it's not, I don't know anyone, including Carlos or Carlos Montero or any of his team, who obviously I work with very closely, any of my colleagues, who would say we should use Nova 4, the original definition of ultra processed food, the definition of ultra processed food, to put warning labels on food, and that would tell us which whether an individual product is healthy or unhealthy. If that's the claim, I would say I fully disagree with that idea. So to understand the utility, so it's very easy if you don't like the idea of ultra processed food, which many scientists don't, to point out all the ways in which the definition is not useful. And most of those critiques I would completely agree with. The utility, to understand its utility, you have to put yourself in the mindset of a scientist in Brazil in the late 90s through to the mid 2010s, going, we've seen a massive transition in the Brazilian diet, and we have lots of really interesting data about it. And it's happened very suddenly. And we've seen an explosion of diet related disease, metabolic disease, and especially obesity. And the same thing has happened across South and Central America. And we see that people have stopped buying fat, salt, and sugar, and they're now consuming sometimes the same amount of fat, salt, and sugar, but in this new industrial form. And so the question you're just initially trying to answer is are the harms coming from this very large number of products? And so the definition is broad and it has blurry edges because it's trying to define a biological group. It's a bit like trying to define mammals. There are mammals around the edges of the definition mammal that we're not kind of sure about. Any biological category has a blurry edge. That's 100% true, almost by necessity. So the definition is trying to capture a dietary pattern, and it has, in that sense, it does it with far greater precision than, for example, dietary definitions of DASH or Mediterranean. That we're all quite comfortable going, we're happy with a high fiber, high fruit veg diet is basically good for you. Fruit and vegetables are good for you. It's like, well, that's a pretty broad definition. But so the definition was created to do epidemiological population research to try and test a hypothesis, and it's worked very, very well for that. It probably wasn't really designed to do RCTs, but it's worked well for RCT research. And when you then say, you're trying to separate out doing research science from informing policy. You can use a definition for research, but how you take the information you gather from that research and apply it to policy has to be done with enormous nuance and subtlety. And just because the definition works in research doesn't mean that you then go, well, this dietary pattern is harmful or healthful, and so we're either going to ban or entirely 100% promote it. Obviously, that's a very extreme position. So in terms of the science, I don't think it's controversial to say we have established causality from eating a dietary pattern that is high in ultra-processed products that causes negative health outcomes. I think that I would argue, I'd go toe to toe with anyone on that. Whether that means, what that does not tell you is that all ultra processed products are equally unhealthy, or that it doesn't give you the policy solutions. They need to come later. The other really important thing that I think a lot of this argument is bad faith. There is a small group of people who are not paid by industry who just have a different perspective, and I think they're legitimately trying to have a debate about it. I believe most of the argument comes from people with a commercial interest in this outcome. A lot of the pushback against ultra processed food, and so when one of the ways in which, if you like, my team or the team I am on is characterized is we want to replace traditional nutrition science with this new ultra processed definition. Everyone I know is saying the UPF definition sits alongside traditional nutrient profile models that can be really effectively used to regulate food. What the UPF data tells us, very simply, is the category of food that is of interest and the companies that are of interest, and the, in my view, entirely obvious idea that the way that we process food does affect the health outcomes beyond its mere nutritional content. And the way I would explain, so the brownie example comes up the whole time. I cook a mean chocolate brownie at home, and I'm sure you can too. I cook good lasagna. I've got a small repertoire of dishes, and I use salt and fat and sugar in them. And I'm fairly good, partly years of speaking to industrial scientists. I'm quite good at making my food extremely delicious. When I cook, we have pretty good evidence, I think, that when you cook domestically, you use less salt and sugar, particularly, than industrial products. But additionally, because the purpose of your cooking is not to drive excessive consumption, it's just to feed people. And because you can't invest, you don't do marketing, the ingredients may cost you more, and you're not putting your products through focus group testing. You're not putting people in MRI scanners to look at the brain responses to the food and the addiction responses. You will just eat less of my chocolate brownie. I'm not as good at making it as the food company, but there will, so per spoonful, my brownie will have less sugar and salt, and you will take fewer spoonfuls. It may not even be less delicious, but I will just not have engineered it to be quite as soft and as hyper palatable, and it won't be marketed. The other thing about my chocolate brownie is you got to come to my house to have it. You know, you can't buy it off the shelf for $1. You've got to come round, and we got to spend time together. And even if I want my chocolate brownie, I just can't eat it immediately. It's not as available. It's not marketed to me. I have to
And it takes
physically
work.
construct. It takes work and construction
Yeah.
effort. So it's that our relationship between these products is very different. So when you go and speak to scientists who work in the food industry, and you, especially if you talk to them off the record, but a lot of them have spoken on the record. I've interviewed many of them in the book and in subsequent documentaries for the BBC. They do use brain scanners to develop ice cream. We know that two companies, Pepsi and Unilever, use brain scanners to look at responses to food. We also know that they do A/B testing in product labs. And when you talk to people in food companies, their main aim is to make as much money as possible. That is the function of a publicly limited company. And so they're like, yeah, of course, we just make the food delicious using the cheapest possible ingredients, and we market it very aggressively. And our aim is to make you eat as much of it as you possibly can. And so the idea, when you flip this thing on its head and you say, is it plausible that food made by large transnational corporations for the purpose of generating growth for institutional investors, is it plausible that food would not be engineered to drive excessive consumption? That's completely impossible. It's just not imaginable. And we also have masses of data. So that's what the science of ultra processed food tells us, is that if you processed food, and I mean the whole lot. I don't just mean the physical, chemical, thermal processing. I mean the packaging, the perfumes, the flavors, the colors, the marketing, the jingle, the cartoon character on the pack, the misleading health claims, and the price point. All of that is ultra processing. And if you get all that right, you can get people to eat a simply vast quantity of food. And we see this when you walk down the street in North America or the United Kingdom. When you go into primary schools and you meet kids the age of my kids, we see pandemic obesity and other diet-related diseases. So the definition is great for science. We know it's good for science because research groups at Yale, Harvard, Oxford, Cambridge, UCL in France, Australia, in the global south, research groups all over the world have used the definition to do population studies and clinical studies. We then have lots and lots of preclinical evidence about individual ingredients. And then we have population data. So if you want to pick holes in any one study, you can look at the Kevin Hall study. You can look at my RCT and tear it to pieces. I mean, if we journal, I'd be anxious to journal club my RCT with you now, Ty. You know, all studies have flaws. when you amass everything together, you're left going, it is explanatory. It is a theory of obesity. And if you're going to say, I don't believe ultra processed food, the science of ultra processing, and I don't believe the definition has utility, what I would then like those people to do is to propose a different theory of obesity to explain why, when we see the industrialization of the diet, we see such rises in obesity and other diet related diseases, and people start eating so much. And then the other thing is, if people say to me, I don't believe a word of all this ultra processed nonsense, that is fine by me. We can still do business, provided you have an answer for what to do about policy. So, what is for me almost, I have never heard the, I think I can say that I have never heard a single one of the voices who criticize the science around ultra processed food make seriously advocate for the kind of public health activities that we know would improve diet related disease. So if you just go, I don't believe the UPF stuff, but let's see some real warning labels on packaged goods. Let's see progressive taxation at reasonable levels for salt and sugar. Let's start warning people about energy density. Let's start subsidizing whole and minimally processed foods. And maybe that wouldn't be a thing they want to do, but let's start really promoting the things that we do all agree on, reductions, serious reductions in processed meat consumption, increases in fresh fruit and vegetables and fiber. I don't hear those voices doing that at all, ever. I mean, maybe you can dredge them up. So my
So yeah.
experience, sorry, go for it, Ty. Sorry, I've spoken,
No, it's
I
great.
can keep going for another
I
hour. So
love
you've got
it.
to
I
interrupt.
love
You've got
it.
to interrupt.
A lot of insights, and I want to break them down a little bit. But just to respond to that is sort of one of the key ways in this sort of metabolic health community, if that's sort of a title. And you said there's what other model of obesity? Well, there's the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. Now, I'm not a big proponent. I think that explains a small part probably of obesity, but in general, the policy suggestion is focus on the refined carbs. Focus on minimizing the refined flours, the refined sugars, all of that. Like that has been proposed, at least from what I have heard. So maybe my question to you.
Maybe I'm less familiar with the sort of low, I guess, the low sugar community. I know some of them, and I think sugar is a huge part of the problem with ultra processed food. And sugar, look, I'm fully on board with a diet high in sugar. We probably have more evidence that sugar is harmful than for any other nutrient component. We know we know there's a very long list of very well evidenced harms. I would love, so I will meet that community on warning labels, progressive taxation on sugar. Absolutely, I'm 100% with them. I don't hear their voices. I don't hear many of their voices really pushing hard on things like effective warning labels, marketing restrictions. Maybe that misrepresents some of them, and maybe some of them really, really have pushed hard. What I tend to see is they're more selling personalized nutrition programs using, there are subscriptions that use continuous glucose monitors. They're sometimes selling diet plans. I see less of a public health emphasis and much more of a kind of personalized nutrition tone to that community. But I shouldn't tar the whole community. To me, if you believe the evidence around the harms of sugar, well, the harms of, processed meat is, that's equally robust evidence. So, and the harms of salt's pretty strong. So, we get back to a nutrient-based approach that I would be very supportive of. And I would be surprised that they couldn't find any common ground around UPF, because I mean, we have an unpublished analysis that shows that almost all UPF is high in either fat, salt, or sugar, and the vast majority is very high in free sugars, like higher than normal WHO, PAHO, UK government guidance,
Yeah,
FDA guidance.
I think the main point is that it's not just the sugars, it's the refined carbs. Again, you're saying this is still a sort of nutrient-based approach, right? But I want to just step back and talk about this key, I think, thing, which is super important. you talked about a diet, not individual foods, right? You said there's little to argue about a diet dominated by ultra processed foods. And I think that's something that is where there should be consensus, right? These studies, when you look at, which are not unrealistic, like you said, 60% of the calories or so in the UK and the US are from ultra processed foods. We're already there. We're already at the, very common, close to that 80%. The main issue that I see that is what we need to really shift is that the whole diet, or most of the diet, being ultra processed foods. So 60% of the calories in the UK and the US are ultra processed foods. And so this is a very practical, real world example that these studies are highlighting, that when you have a diet that is majority ultra processed foods, it's going to wreak havoc on health, and it's going to contribute to obesity, right? I want to hear now, so the science, I totally agree with you. Like, I 100%, the profit, the marketing, these foods have chemists, they're putting people in brain scans, they're hyper palatable. You kind of described this like, I don't even necessarily want to eat it, but I feel compelled to eat it. The location they're accessible. The whole industry is about growth and profit, and so they just want you to consume as much as possible. I agree with all of that. Now, can we talk practically? Then there is this question of what do we do about it? Because you said the policy level, you actually said let's not put warning labels on ultra processed foods. Now, in South America, my understanding is that is
Oh no,
already
I
happening.
would.
Okay.
Oh no, I would put warning labels on. It just wouldn't use the definition ultra Nova Group for UPF to put. I wouldn't use it as the sort of diagnostic category to go, if it's a UPF, we're going to label it bad. And if it's not a UPF, we're going to label it good. That's what I mean.
So what would you use? That's my question. How would you
So
sort of approach this?
the history of the company, some of the companies that feed us, is ultra processed food has its origins in the tobacco industry. The biggest food companies in the world in the mid 1980s were also the biggest tobacco companies. Philip Morris and RJ Reynolds bought General Foods, Kraft, Nabisco, and they've been buying up different brands for a long time. And they used, we know because of the work of Laura Schmidt and others, some incredible work in the tobacco archives. They used the molecules and the marketing techniques and many of the other tools and technologies. They transferred it from cigarettes to make food products, and they used the same supply chain and blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
So I think tobacco provided the template for the food industry to supply us with harmful food, and now we have to use the regulatory template. And so you don't just blindly, I'm not saying you put all ultra processed food in plain packaging with warning labels and massively high taxes. You do it with nuance, but it tells you that one policy isn't going to work. So warning labels are not going to work, but you do need warning labels. So I think the Pan American Health Organization and colleagues in Mexico, Chile, Colombia, Brazil have a really sophisticated suite of policies. And it's not a single policy. I would say that your starting point is the accurate labeling of harmful products. And for that, you use a nutrient profile model. And in the UK, and the devil's in the detail there. So in the UK, we have very good government guidance around levels of fat, salt, and sugar that we should eat. But the voluntary advice labels on our packets have nothing to do with government guidance. So you can have a Cocoa Pop cereal that's 70% of the calories come from free sugar, and is generally, I think most people would agree, is not the foundation of a healthy diet, but it doesn't get a red warning label. It gets orange and green. It's very salty. It's very sugary. And the same is true for
Mm-hmm.
lots of products. So you use a really good, robust nutrient profile. That US has good guidance, WHO, PAHO, UK. Broadly, we agree about the amounts of salt, fat, sugar, energy you should eat. And you use that to apply warning labels for, I think, non-nutritive sweeteners are important because even though the health effects are contested, they are the way out of the sugar labels. So I think they are important to put a warning label on. Sugars, saturated fat, total fat, calories, energy density, if you like, and then caffeine. And then you can add other things if you need to. Once you've got a warning label system, once the emulsifier evidence for a particular emulsifier reaches the threshold, you get a warning label for that. The warning label doesn't work well on its own, but we know it works and we know it shifts purchasing. Once a product has a warning label, this whole suite of other policies come into effect. You can't have a warning label and have a health claim. So in the UK, we have a wild situation. In fact, Ty, I should have disclosed this. You know, I'm now a manufacturer of ultra processed food. So
Oh, I saw a post on this.
I've
Yes.
released this thing called a killer bar. I'm showing it to you now. We've made a bar that is high in saturated fat, high in sugar, and high in calories, according to our government guidance. Yet we've simultaneously been able to make 200 health claims well, we have to put them online. We can't fit them on the packet. And we can say it's got health and nutritional benefits, 19 grams of protein, it's high in fiber, it's low in salt, and it's got a picture of an orange. And so you need a system where you go, if a food is harmful because it's really sugary or really salty, it can't also be healthy. That isn't how physiology works. You're not like, well, if we add protein, we'll offset the harms of the salt. That it doesn't do
Hmm.
that. So you need coherence. So you put the warning labels on for the nutrient profile, and you can negotiate around all that. Then if it gets a bunch of warning labels, you tax it. If it gets any warning label, you can't make a health claim. If it gets any warning label, you can't sell it to a child. You can't have a cartoon character on it. You can't market it. And so you use a nutrient profile to label food accurately, and then a whole raft of other restrictions come in that basically derive from tobacco. And the food industry is incredible at getting around these. So my colleagues in Mexico tell the most amazing stories where one colleague was saying, in order to get around a warning label for sugar, the companies have started to add an ingredient called candy floss flavor, which is sugar. But by calling it candy floss flavor, it doesn't show up on the computer
There's a lot
labeling.
of different words for sugar. Food
It's
manufacturers have found a
it's
lot of different ways to label that.
it's incredible. Or if the law requires a front of pack label, you make circular packets, or you make the front and the back the same, or you employ people to go into shops and turn all the packs around so the labels face backwards. That happens too. So, or, there's lots of stuff we can do, and it's all completely compatible with existing nutritional guidance. It's all very kind of low hanging fruit, mainstream stuff. And I feel like as a community, actually, almost everyone who isn't funded by a giant food company, basically, surely we all agree that food should have a warning label for salt, sugar, and energy density. Do we not have consensus around soft, energy dense food make us gain weight? Um,
Yeah.
so it's not to say that all that is simple, but I feel like if you have a sincere interest in public health, actually, I think it's very hard to argue against those specific policy recommendations. The final thing is PAHO and all of these countries are labeling both. They use Nova 4. They use the Nova classification 1, 2, 3, 4, where 3 is processed food and 4 is ultra processed food. But the labels can be applied to 3 or 4, i.e., if you make if you make a store lasagna and it's not ultra processed, it's got no additives, it's just a straightforward lasagna, but it's very high in sugar and salt, it's going to get warning labels. So that's the other really important thing is ultra processed food does not capture all unhealthy food.
Hmm.
Does
So,
that seem
okay.
reasonable? But I mean, push back on all of this because I don't often get to have a good faith argument with a real expert. I retreat from arguments with industry because you generally lose them.
Well, let me just make sure I'm understanding correctly. So you're sort of in favor of a nutrient labeling approach that is sort of it it does a lot of different things, but it focuses on specific nutrients that trigger different types of warning labels. So if you're too high in sugar, if you're too high in energy density, um, some of these already have consensus where I think there's probably you could get policies passed. A lot of these don't. So things like the emulsifier, maybe
I
it's an
wouldn't.
artificial.
I think
Yeah.
at this stage I wouldn't put a warning label on for emulsifiers because I think you have to get the easy wins. And we also know you don't need a warning label for emulsifiers because so much ultra processed food is high in fat, salt, sugar, and energy. You don't even really need the energy label.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that this is where the feedback comes in. It's like, well, okay, the unsweetened soy milk, that has guar gum or something, some sort of emulsifier, it's like that's going to be a pretty healthy option, right? And what I'm hearing you say is like focusing on the biggest offenders and making it cumulative.
If you're ultra processed, so people do this the whole time. They go, well, what about all the healthy ultra processed food, like all the ultra processed bread? So my group did a nutrient profile of all the ultra processed bread in the UK. Every single loaf was, I think I'm ready to say this. I'm going to be maybe exaggerating slightly. Nearly all of them were high in salt. Nearly all of them were high in energy density, and nearly all of them were high in free sugars. So it's like, sure, if
I
you
think the
can
vast
make
majority, yeah.
if you can make your soy milk so that it isn't high in salt, fat, sugar, or energy, and then go for it. I wouldn't put a warning label on it. I don't care about it at all.
So then this gets to the mechanism. So okay, so there are exceptions. So for example, some of the breakfast cereals like Cheerios, that is one where it'll certainly score high on it scores high on all the nutrient profiling systems, right? But it's technically classified as ultra processed. Now I don't think Cheerios are, the normal Cheerios, of course. Honey Nut Cheerios has 12 grams of 12 grams of sugar per serving, added sugar. But I don't think normal Cheerios are really a big issue here. So I would be fine with those scoring well. I think that I want to understand this mechanism of high in salt, sugar, fat, sodium.
I'm
What
looking
is it?
up Cheerios. I'm looking up Cheerios now. Yeah, I mean,
They'll score off the like Food
yeah,
Compass. They score like 95, right? They score very, very high. I think on Nutri-Score they probably get an A.
yeah.
Right, they're going to be great, but again, they are ultra processed. So there is that sort of critique, and again, even with these, they're whole grain, but it's sort of like these have gone through a lot of processing that it's not the same as having a bowl of oatmeal. Now oatmeal itself could score lower than Cheerios because of again, that's sort of the manufacturers can put together these products that are low in the components that would score them negatively in a nutrient profiling system. But I want to hear a little bit more about, we have these studies like the Kevin Hall study, they matched for fat, sodium, added sugar, energy density, right? Like the whole point is that it's not just the nutrients in these foods, it's the combination of these ingredients. It's the formulation, it's the textures,
Yeah.
it's the
So
hyperpalatability.
so
Yeah.
in the case of the Cheerios, I would say it is almost impossible to design an experiment that will tell you whether Cheerios are healthier or less healthy than, I don't know, oatmeal porridge with a spoonful of sugar on it. Nutrient matched oatmeal porridge, like put in a pinch of salt, put in a little bit of sugar, and
Mm-hmm.
use the same milk. I just can't think how we do that experiment. What are we're going to feed kids in a lab for 10 years? I mean, it's not, it's an impossible question to answer. And if someone says, well, if you're saying a diet high in ultra processed food is harmful, you're saying ultra processed food is harmful, but what about Cheerios? I'd go, well, what about Cheerios? I'm not saying, no one is saying all ultra processed food is equally harmful. Definitely not. So in a sense,
But the food
it's a straw
manufacturer,
man.
they could be saying, well, I don't think it's fully a straw man because if there is, so now there are stop signs, I believe. In some countries, there are
Yeah.
stop signs for having Nova 4.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
for
Or some
having
sort of,
Nova 4.
yeah, or at least the
I think,
policies that change what the branding can be or whatnot, right?
uh,
You can't have.
I believe the policies are all, maybe I'm wrong about this, but in all the countries I know, and I looked fairly recently, and I'd love someone to correct me on this. I think the labeling is always using a nutrient profile, and that's not the same as saying that the only harms of the food come from the nutrients. It's saying we can put warning labels on ultra processed food and other harmful processed food using nutrients that sweep up almost all of the products that you want to fuss about. And in pragmatic terms, no one can really argue about energy density and sugar and salt. So let's just go with that and not get into the weeds of whether emulsifiers or non-nutritive sweeteners are good or bad. So that the
Okay.
point is, it's not an acknowledgement of the uselessness of the definition. It's saying we can deal with all these foods by labeling them with
Okay.
with a score. Does that make sense?
So maybe, yeah. So maybe there aren't. Maybe I had that wrong. I think my
You may be
question then
right.
is,
I just
it
don't
it
know.
sounds like these are all of the policy options are really actually getting at the ingredients. And now, if we can just step back and look at the policies that are coming, I don't know if you follow much of the stuff in the U.S., but several states, including my own state of Arizona, have passed school meal policies that basically are targeting anywhere from 5 to 15 individual ingredients that are not going to be allowed to be produced in school meals. What that does is it's essentially identifying the ingredients with the worst offenders that have maybe the most evidence behind them of being contributing to health risks and obesity and things like that. They're they're sort of preventing any ability to have an ultra processed food, but they're doing it through a approach to the actual ingredients listed. Now, California, I believe, is different. California actually just passed something which is going to take years and years to get implemented, where they actually created a definition of ultra processed foods and are actually trying to make it illegal or not allowed to produce ultra processed foods in schools, something like that. So, okay, so if I understand you correctly, now what is my sort of feedback on that? I think that you can capture the bulk of the health risks of these products either through nutrient profiling or through Nova 4. I think that it would be, I think that if you incentivize production of more minimally processed fresh foods and you disincentivize production of ultra processed foods, that's going to generally shift things in the right direction, but you're going to have a bunch of pushback about what about this product? What about the normal Cheerios? What about the unsweetened soy milk? What about the tofu? So you're going to have all that pushback. So I think focusing on, I've worked on nutrient profiling models. I know there are ways to do it. You can do the sodium to potassium ratio. That's a huge way. You can do the carb to fiber ratio. You can look at the unsaturated to or saturated to unsaturated fat ratio. Those are really key ways. In addition to having nutrients, you can look at, the overall fiber content, the micronutrient content, the protein content. So I do think there's ways to detect them. I think the challenge is understanding how do you actually, like you said at the beginning, I think, is that education alone, people may be aware generally what's a healthy diet. That's not changing it. And there's a lot of momentum and there's a lot of effort that would be needed to change from where we're at, of 60% of these calories coming from really unhealthy foods, at least. So do you think these policies, now you said something like, okay, if you get one offense, if you violate one offense, then you can't market your foods or you can't sell them to children or you can't put maybe characters on the box. If you have multiple offenses, then you can get taxed potentially. And then maybe those taxes could be invested into subsidizing fruits and vegetables or other, you know, foods that people would agree largely are beneficial. Do you think, my understanding too is that like the packaging, the label itself for the actual shopper, it's going to make some difference, but it's pretty small, pretty minor, but it's the overall shift in, well, now it's the procurement policies. What can these companies sell at schools, and what is going to get into hospitals or whatever? All of these kind of big levers, I think, that make a challenge, right? Or like you said, it's sort of the additive of, okay, but now you can't market, now you can't do this, and so it's sort of, that's a big part of it. Is there anything else that we need to do? Like, what are the? Do you feel hopeful? Do you feel like, oh, I can really see that we can actually turn this around? And when you look, I look globally a lot. We haven't talked too much about this, but the trend in ultra processed food consumption is increasing rapidly in Africa and Asia. And it's very clear as countries develop, as they gain more wealth, they start purchasing and consuming more and more of these Western ultra processed foods. And so, how do you stop that? How do you actually make a big difference? I mean, I can look at some countries like France, Italy, Japan, and say they have much lower ultra processed food and lower chronic disease rates than the UK and the US. So they're doing something right. But how can you actually implement that globally or in the US or the UK?
Maybe the mistake is to think that France and Japan are kind of doing something active and correct. And the truth may be they're just further behind. They don't speak English. Is it? I always feel uncomfortable. My younger brother is now an American citizen. I love America. I've lived there. My twin lived in America, so I don't say this with any anti-American sentiment. America exports the greatest things around the world, but I think we are broadly talking about a kind of American diet when we talk about ultra processed food, even though a lot of it is
Yeah.
made by Swiss and French companies.
Yeah.
Uh, so if you have a very strong traditional food culture that is really part of your national identity, that is built around traditional, domestic cooking, and you don't speak English and you're a little bit more removed from the US, you may just be further behind. But I mean, rates of UPF consumption are going up. There's Starbucks in Milan now. There is McDonald's in Tokyo. It's happening everywhere, and we see rising rate. We see KFC in West Africa. I mean, in one of the most kind of savage, horrific ironies, we've got food invented by enslaved peoples, co-opted by transnational corporations, now being exported back by corporations owned broadly by, let's be honest, global shareholders in the global north, most of whom will be white, exporting these
Mm-hmm.
products back to the very place that the enslaved people were initially taken from. So the 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 other mistake is to think that because my advocacy, so I feel like what I've asked for in the UK is such a tiny thing. My advocacy is all around going, could we just have more mandatory warning labels on food according to UK government guidance? That would be it. Could we extend our sugar tax to not just being sugar sweetened beverages, but to candy as well? That another, I think,
Sort
somewhat
of no
reasonable.
brainers, not
I mean,
not
just
like
like
controversial.
none of it. Like, can we ban ultra processed food? I spend a lot of time going, I don't care if you believe in ultra processed food. In a way, I would have this whole interview, if you had just talked about kind of harmful junk food, I'd have been completely happy with that. So the mistake is thinking, because those of us who are simply, I hope sincerely, I mean, I work with so many incredible people who have just dedicated so much longer than me to trying to limit the effects of diet related disease. Because we are failing, we're doing something wrong. I think that is probably incorrect. The consumer facing marketing budget of a company like Nestle, for example, depending on how you calculate it, is something around 10 to 20 billion US dollars a year. That's one company. So my budget is effectively zero. The effective budget of public, good public health advocacy is functionally zero compared to that one company. And so we're failing because this is an issue of corporate power and a political stance on regulation. And the optimism question, I think I have two sources of optimism which are interlinked. One is that you and I are not smoking on this call, right? By the 1950s, mid
Mm-hmm.
1950s, we were sure that cigarettes caused cancer. It took fully 50, 60 years to have the kind of regulations, the kind of common sense regulations. No, cigarette companies haven't got out of business. If you bought a share in Philip Morris just prior to regulation in 1990, that share you would have outperformed the S&P 500. It's hard to calculate it, but you would have done very well. So we haven't put the cigarette industry out of business. So uh, we succeeded with tobacco, although it took 50 to 60 years to do it. So there is a template. And we succeeded with asbestos, with seat belts, with alcohol sales to kids. There's a few little public health successes. Um, the the second source of optimism, I think, is the lawsuit that was filed earlier in the States this year by lawyers at Morgan and Morgan, and it did not. It's not quite clear what's going to happen with it. The motion to dismiss was granted, but I think they're still going through appeals. But this, in the end, is how it will be sorted out. I think the many people who are harmed by diet related disease are extremely clear on the products that harm them. They'll tell you what they can't stop eating. They'll tell you the stuff that drives their weight gain, and they
Mm-hmm.
won't. The mechanisms they won't much care about. They know what it is, and they're often quite clear about the mechanisms. And I think those people are, hopefully what will happen is the states will go, we need our healthcare costs back. So Walter Willett, someone for whom I obviously have enormous respect in many ways, but the question I would love to ask Walter, and I hope I will get to ask him this, I'm trying to speak to him, is to say, well, if it's all just fizzy drinks, is none of the rest of the food doing harm? And if it is doing harm, what changed to make us eat so much of it? That's the question. Is somehow we have started eating more calories, and I don't think I really believe that if we banned fizzy drinks, that would solve the problem. Perhaps it would, in which case, great. I'll be cheering for those restrictions all the way. I'm fully on board with anyone who wants to do that. But let's say it's more than the fizzy drinks. You have to have a theory about why in the mid 1970s we all started to eat more calories. They didn't. We've had cheap, abundant calories in the United States. You have had dirt cheap sugar and fat and calories for decades before anyone gained weight.
Mm-hmm.
Population obesity was pretty static for a long time. So I ultra processing, remember, is the marketing, it is the packaging, it is the health claims, it is the whole lot. And which exact part of the food is driving it, I don't much care about. But you have to have a theory about why we started consuming more calories. And I think the most persuasive theory, that the one for which we have the most evidence, is that our food began to be carefully engineered for the purposes of making money. And that meant the cost of ingredients plummeted. So we started losing good stuff from the food, and technologies, huge range of different technologies were used to make food that interfered with our appetite. And that's what we saw in my little N=1 experiment of just me and measuring the PYY. And it's what we see in the RCTs, and it's what we see in the animal studies. And it's what the people in the development labs in the food companies tell me is they make two products. They make, product A, product B. We feed them to a room full of people. If people eat product A more quickly and they eat more of it, that's the one that goes on the shelf. And then the next year, product A comes back and it's back in the lab versus product C. And if product C they eat more of, and this has been iterated every year since the late 60s, early 70s. This is what food companies have been doing.
And it's adaptive, so that as it's basically always continually trying to optimize consumption,
Yes.
sales, profit, right? So as people get sick of something, they'll get some new product that meets that demand, right? Yeah.
Right. So the line extensions. And I don't cast food companies as I mean, they do commit atrocities, and I've reported on this around the world. That's unquestionable. But the issue is not really the companies. The companies are doing what we've asked them to do, which is,
playing by the rules of the game.
Right. And and I've said we saw this at Danone. Emmanuel Faber running Danone is like, I'm going to turn it into a social enterprise. I'm going to make our product portfolio really healthy. He was fired like this by activist investors, Bluebell Capital, who were like, you've got our pension funds. How dare you do this? You're tanking. And I'm very sympathetic to Bluebell Capital. I have a pension. It sits in a fund. It's not very big because I turn down all the money from the food companies, but it's there nonetheless. And I need to retire at some point. So for solutions, we're going to need to think about proper regulation that isn't going to shut down business. It's not going to close the economy. We could see the flourishing of so many different companies that small and medium-sized businesses that pay lots of tax. They're local in the US. They sell healthy food. We could have schools employing chefs. We can see employment go up. There's all kinds of models that are not partisan. This is not, in my view, a leftist agenda. This is not, anti-business, but it is a little bit saying that we need better some pretty light touch regulation of the most powerful corporate entities.
Yeah, well, you're sort of speaking to the choir. I agree with you 100% on all of that. It is encouraging to look at the tobacco, the cigarette industry. I think I'm a little concerned about vaping taking the place coming up now. But like in general, like that's been a huge win. It took a long time, and maybe we forget how long things can take when you're in the middle of something. So there are a lot of encouraging signs that we are shifting in the right direction. One final question, and I want to be respectful of your time.
Can I say one thing about that? The reason it took a long time, in my opinion, I think this is very well evidenced, was because of conflicts of interest. It's because the industry knew that when the cigarette companies said, "Oh, cigarettes are fine," no one believed them. When they employed doctors, particularly, and scientists to do more research to question the mechanisms, That's what caused the delay. And we now see so many big food industry funded trials going, well, we are a little bit concerned about this UPF stuff. It's complicated, but what we want to do is really understand the mechanisms. It's like the barrel is very full of fish. It's going to be hard to hit the right one. There are going to be a million mechanisms just pointing at the nutrient profile for a start, let alone we got more than enough evidence on the mechanisms to have action. So one of the big issues for me is all the criticism that is leveled at me. Industry shower me with money. They are so nice. They invite me to their conferences. McDonald's invited me to be an ambassador. I'm serious. I'll send you the email. It's hilarious. And I say no to all of it. The vitriol comes from scientists who are paid either directly by industry or by big charities who are funded by industry. And that it's a very UK specific thing, but the conflicts of interest are so severe here. So that was the most important thing that happened with tobacco, is whether it was writing policy or doing science or the scientific journals, they started to go, if to be really honest with you, if Coke or McDonald's or Yum or Pepsi or Kraft Heinz, if any of these companies fund health studies, in my opinion, reputable peer-reviewed scientific journals about nutrition should not publish them. It's not good science. Now, if Pepsi fund a study or Coke fund a study saying, here's how to make fizzy drinks fizzier, I'll read that article. That's great. They're not conflicted. But if Coke fund research about whether the true cause of obesity is soft drinks or exercise, I don't think good journals should publish that stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Well, it
that
is
was
a huge problem.
a small rant.
I agree with you. I think that this is a hard battle to win. I don't think it's easy. And it's also probably, there's the folks who have plenty of money and they could get industry money and they can decline it. But then there's also the folks who are just struggling and getting any money right now. It's like, it's hard to decline
Yes.
that, right?
Yes.
So I think that that's an issue, but you're right. I think that
No, you know what, Ty? Can I completely acknowledge that? I'll say I'm from a middle class family. I went to a private school. I'm a physician. I'm not a wealthy person, but I live with privilege and I have enough money. It's easy for me to turn down food industry money, and I make a living kind of by doing it. I sell books about it. So I completely acknowledge that it's very hard for people have bills and they're trying to run a research program, and yes, we need big institutional funding in this area. So my aim is not to shame.
Yeah.
There are some individuals that probably would shame, but we need the philanthropies
Let's
and the
name them
NIH
right
to
here.
come in.
Just kidding.
No, there are very few people I would shame. We've all got bills, and most people are really trying to do a good job.
Yeah. Okay. Last question. I want to be respectful of your time. I've joked that family members of people like you and me that kind of work on this ultra processed foods area, they need a support group just to get through dinner, because we can borderline on extreme, I think, at times. I don't know how you are, but I would love to hear, like, in your own family, do you have any challenges when it comes to food? How do you balance between trying to be aware and having healthy diets, but not going too far? How do you balance that out?
So I have three girls, age 8, 5, and 1. I would have when I published the book and was doing a lot of TV around this area, I'd have journalists come to the house, and we had a big blue bowl of junk that I would kind of show the journalists to go, look, I am a man of the people here. I'm a moderate person. My kids eat junk food. And then we realized our kids were actually eating really badly, that in an effort to not be a kind of Puritan about it, they were just eating a lot of convenience food and candy, like every night after dinner. They were having it. They were just coming and helping themselves. So I then started to work a lot more with eating disorders scientists. So I went to the Eating Disorders Research Society conference last year in Sitges and gave the keynote. And I teach on an eating disorders module at the master's students at UCL. And so I asked them a lot about how do we kind of avoid disordered eating? Because I think there is a growing idea among some eating disorders researchers, including the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK, that disorders eating may be partly a result of disordered food environment. If your food is engineered so that you can't have a healthy relationship with it, could ultra processed food be contributing? So you have to do this all very carefully. The macro, I don't want to drive orthorexia eating disorders in the population when I communicate about this. I also don't want to do it at home. So I spoke to, anyway, I'm going to boil down. I like collared everyone at the drinks after the conference and was like, how do we avoid eating disorders? And they said, look, no one really knows, but there's some stuff we all agree on, which is you eat 3 meals a day. You don't snack too much. You sit down at a table. And it was really funny how specific they were. You sit down at a table and you eat real food off a china plate using a knife and fork, not in front of a television and not in a car. And I was like, whoa, okay, that's a real. I was like, do you have evidence for this? And they're like, not really. It's just what we all do. And we're pretty sure about it. And so we try and do that when the girls go to. Do you have kids, Ty?
So I have an 8 and 5-year-old daughters, so very
Oh, there we
similar
go.
ages.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, look, okay. I'm okay for time. I want your answer to this. I want to check in with you. You have much more expertise in many respects than I do. When they go to parties, which is, the social diary of an 8-year-old these days is much more vigorous than mine. Most weekends they have a party. They can do whatever they want. If they want to drink, my 8-year-old drank a can of Coke at the last party she was at, and didn't, I think, was like, yeah, she didn't quite see what the fuss was about. So they can do what they want at parties. I try and warn them that, particular foods and food groups are unhealthy. I tell them how good for them fruit and veg are. But this is all privilege. My kids can eat well because we live in a food apartheid in the UK. The reason, I strongly believe, the reason that most people don't eat a good diet is because in the UK they are unable to. It is so expensive. You have to own the equipment. You need the time. You need a big fridge. You need to batch cook and freeze it. You need a great big chest freezer. You need skills that in some communities have been lost for several generations, and you need places to buy whole ingredients and blah blah blah. So I don't say any of this as advice, but anyway, that's what I do. What do you think? Am I getting it right? Am I getting it wrong?
I think you're finding the right balance. I'm sort of struggling with this myself because I tend towards probably borderline orthorexia of being extreme myself. Like I like to eat a certain way, and I think
Do you
I
ever?
have.
Can I ask you? Do you personally? I should interview. I want to get you on. I have a podcast too, so I'm gonna see if I realize that. God, I should be interviewing you. Um, Tell me about. Can I just ask you about that? Do you eat any UPF or like packaged junk? Do you have any weaknesses? A little
I
treat on a
do, but
Friday?
I'm all about having treats. I think that people would think of my treats as pretty lame. Like I will have these
An apple?
dark chocolate covered cashews with
Yeah.
like 3 grams of added sugar per serving, and I'll have these, these honey chocolate or honey peanut butter type bars. So I do enjoy having treats. Every once in a while, I have this ice cream that, there's this ice cream that my both girls really like. This salted caramel, perfect ultra pro. I'm sure they had a brain scan because we all are like drooling thinking about this ice cream. So I love having some. I like having things in sort of moderation. I think what I've sort of tried to do is not be too extreme because I think as I've had a couple of people actually on recently talk about eating disorders, and they even say the terms, I use this all the time. And so do my colleagues, like, oh, this is healthy or this is unhealthy. And they're like, well, but that can lead towards, all food has a role to play and it's not necessarily. So I'm a bit torn, honestly. When my daughters were under 2, they ate incredibly, like nutrient dense, all unprocessed, minimally processed foods. And then when they got into daycare and schools, their palates were overwhelmed by ultra processed foods. They were getting cinnamon rolls and Lucky Charms daily. And so then when they come home, they don't want to eat the food that they used to like. And so I've struggled with this. How do I find the balance? And so I think if you looked in my pantry and you find some of the more sugary breakfast cereals, it's something that I have a hard time with buying, but I also am trying to sort of moderate it. And I have sort of we try to do things like 80/20, where it's like, okay, during the week, it's the same thing with TV. Like we don't really watch TV shows during the day on a weekday, but then we have a movie night. And then the weekends we do TV during the day. And I like that approach. I think it's the right balance because like you maybe you mentioned, but it's like trying to find the balance. There are most people you could say are metabolically unhealthy by some markers. And eating disorders and disordered eating are a real problem, especially among teens and children in different populations. And so I don't want to be so extreme. I want to find a way to nourish and realize, okay, nutrition is my area. That's super important. But there's also a lot of other aspects of well-being. There's mental health, there's community,
Mm.
there's right. And so I think I have been a little too extreme with the nutrition has to be dialed in. That's the top priority. And I think it's been I've sort of made a shift recently over the last couple of years to try to loosen up. But I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. So I would love to hear your thoughts about it.
The moderation thing is so intriguing because I think there are a group of people who can just be moderate, who can have. I mean, I'm someone who, yeah, when I was young, I'd have a few cigarettes on a Friday night. Never ever wanted any more cigarettes. I could enjoy them like some people. I could enjoy a beer on a Friday night. Never wanted a beer on a
Mm-hmm.
Monday morning. With the food, I found it very different, and I think there are many people who live with disordered eating takes many shapes and forms, and for people who live with food addiction, in general, some fairly low quality data shows that they are typically addicted to ultra processed foods. Not all of them, but the foods they struggle with. And food addiction also is poorly defined. And I know there are all these caveats. For those people, I think moderation, it's like saying, well, to someone who lives with a problem relationship with cigarettes and alcohol, well, or heroin, just have
Just
one
have a
line
little
of
bit.
cocaine. Just have a little bit. The problem with this stuff is heroin is quite moreish, and it's hard to be moderate for individuals. And we're all a bit different with what our thing is. So I I I also think, speaking to colleagues on the eating disorders faculty at our Royal College of Psychiatrists, and Agnes Aiton and Kate Chanturia have done some really interesting kind of work on this, and that they're asking really important questions, going with people who are exerting excessive control over eating, with people who are binging on food. It is legitimate to ask the question: to what extent are these highly engineered foods causing that relationship, and to look at the correlation, very much not causation. When you industrialize a diet, that's when you generally see, now lots of other things happen at the same time, that's when you see the rise of disordered eating. So I think these are vexed areas. All foods have a role. Look, that is probably true for some people. I know a great many of my patients, and I'd say for me, there are products that have no more of a role than, and I say this as someone I think who's got quite a disordered relationship with food in a number of specific ways. I think there are products that for me are, I would say, they're harmful for me, and I don't like them, and they're bad for my mental health, and they may make me feel not in control. I don't mean they're literally, I mean, maybe physically they're inflaming my brain or making me unhappy in some other way, but they make me feel like I cannot trust myself.
You
And
know, I relate. Like if I eat something, the main motivator for me is how I feel. If I eat something and immediately afterwards I feel bad, I don't want to eat that food. And I, like you, if I was on the ultra processed diet, like it doesn't even have to be ultra processed. If it was homemade cookies, I would eat the entire plate. I would probably eat
yeah,
3,000, 4,000 calories in a sitting because I do have that propensity to just as soon as I'm even the food is slowly going down my, I'm chewing it, I immediately want the next bite. So I agree with you. I remember staying with a family when I was younger in California when I was doing some internship, and they would always have their little dessert afterwards, and they put like a little teaspoon of ice cream in a little mini cup, and they would just enjoy it. And I would get this huge bowl, and then as soon as I was done, I was like, I want seconds, and I never understood. So I think you're right. Like there are people who can handle the moderation thing, and there are people who can't. I mean, with my children, I moderate for them, I think, at this point because they're young enough, but I will make sure you eat enough vegetables, right? Like, and I try to put all these options out on the table and let them choose because it gives them agency, and they end up selecting usually a variety of things as long as there's enough options.
I think the other point I'm going to go and reflect on much more deeply is this idea that, like, health is multidimensional, and you can live with metabolic disease, diet related disease, and be a completely happy, healthy person in all these other dimensions. And we have friends and colleagues, and And you can also be metabolically incredible, but deeply unhappy and unhealthy in a whole bunch of other ways. And so I think the other thing all the eating disorder scientists, and I shouldn't be saying they all said this. I'm using a bit of shorthand here, but something that many of them emphasized to me was not making dinner a battleground and not shaming people around food. And I had this relationship with my identical twin when he put on the weight. I was very ashamed of him. I felt it reflected badly on me, and I really judged him about this. I've written a lot about this. And when we went and spoke to a bunch of people about this, it was a journey. But when I let that go and I was like, oh, I really love my brother, and why would I, when I kind of realized, oh, it's not him, it changed our relationship in the most astounding way. And I think there are so many families where, girls really have society puts a very particular pressure, I think, on women and girls about this, but not judging people about this. And that's the hardest thing. I'm sure you find this. For me, communicating about this is going, I want justice and equity, and I want more fairness, and I want to limit corporate power, but I don't want to drive eating disorders. I don't want to make anyone feel bad. And I don't know if it's possible to say, there is a dietary pattern that we have quite good evidence harms people. There are nutrients that we think you need to limit. And to say that without shaming and stigmatizing the people who have eaten too many of them for whatever reason, I think it's a wicked problem. But I think if we remain alive to that, and we try and acknowledge that, and we try and remember the people listening who are struggling, and try and have a good intention, that may be the best we can do.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think the context matters, right? I think at a population level, I think we have a huge problem with overconsumption. And it's different if you are a practitioner who is working with somebody who's struggling with an eating disorder, or you're a person who is susceptible to an eating disorder. You need a different message, right? I remember I did this conference at the American Society for Nutrition a few years ago, and I had I was presenting on adolescent diets and patterns and all that. And there was somebody who was an eating disorder specialist, and she was at our conference, which is a fully nutrition conference, and we're saying obesity and fat and body fatness and unhealthy. And she's like, we don't even say these words at our conference. Like, you don't say the word obesity because there's such a different audience. And I think that was eye-opening to me to realize the messaging really does depend. What is the person that you're communicating with? And I think if there's no judgment, if there's not sort of there's blame, right? If there's not a blame, if there's not sort of the physical standards, I think that's the problem, right? Like, maybe in the health community, you need to look a certain way to be respected or loved, especially for women. That is a problem. So I think if it's sort of communicated with empathy, of, like you said, there's actually, I think you may even said, there's a disordered food environment. I love that, because it's not the individuals who are having a problem with this. It's really that we have this food environment that's the biggest driver. And there is individual agency and a role for everyone to play. But the problem is that it's very hard to be healthy and pursue sort of well-being and wellness in our current culture and society. And I think that takes a lot of empathy. And if we communicate with empathy, it'll probably be received better.
I'm very conscious. One of the things that's often thrown at me by industrially funded scientists is the risk of shaming people. That by saying a dietary pattern of high and ultra processed food has been shown to cause health harms, I'm shaming people who are forced to eat it. And it seems such an upside down. It's such a clever argument, because it's actually quite hard to really tear it to pieces. But I think my model of what my experience of this within my family, my friends, and my patients, and myself, is what drives shame, whether it's self-shame or the shame on others, is a food environment that forces people to eat food that harms them. And it's the failure to regulate from policymakers, and it's an industry that profits, and it's charities in the middle confusing the message. That's where, in my formulation, the shame comes from. And
Mhm.
we would diminish shame if we had a diet that was, we haven't even talked about the planet, but that was good for the planet, good for our bodies, and if that was affordable and accessible for everyone. And And I am someone also who would like all the junk to still be available. I really don't want to ban anything, but I really believe when people can afford healthy food, they broadly choose to eat it. I can afford to go across. I can afford to eat junk every day. I can make a choice, and almost everyone who can does. So I think you talked about personal responsibility. I think in my sort of stated model of the world, that I've got that down to almost a singularity. I think people eat the food they're forced to eat, the food that's in front of them, the food in their school, in their workplaces, that's marketed to them, and we choose our food. I'm a bit extreme about this. I think we have almost as much choice over our food as we do about the amount of water we drink or the air we breathe. It's the water we swim in, and I
Yeah.
don't know. I think in policy terms, I'm quite firm about that. I think people eat the food they're forced to.
I fully agree. Wow. Okay, this was very enlightening. You're doing great work. I love your ability to communicate, to be human, to have humor, and so I'm just so thankful you took the time, Dr. Chris Van Tulleken. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
Oh, Ty, thank you so much. We need to reciprocate. I've come away with more questions than answers, but I really appreciate it. It's been wonderful speaking to you.
Absolutely. Yeah.